The earth on the Eastern Front didn't just hold the dead, it drunk them. By the winter of 1944, the soil near Vitebsky had absorbed so much blood, so much bone, so much ash that it no longer looked like earth at all, but like clotted tar, slicked with frost. The wind didn't howl there. It whispered, low and ragged, through the ribs of shattered tanks and the splintered frames of barns that had once housed cattle but now sheltered only rats and the occasional frozen corpse. This was the kind of place where mercy wasn't just rare, it was considered a betrayal. I remember the day they brought in the prisoners, not in trucks, not in columns, but on foot, stumbling through the snow like ghosts already halfway to the other side. 37 men, or what passed for men faces hollowed by hunger, eyes glazed with the dull sheen of men who had seen the last thing they ever wanted to see. Their uniforms were rags stitched with ice, their boots split at the seams, their hands bound not with rope, but with salvaged telephone wire, the kind we'd ripped from German field command posts weeks earlier. Standard procedure: strip them of insignia, interrogate the officers, then march them to the rear for labor battalions are. More often, for the ravines where unmarked graves waited like open mouths. But this group was different. At the end of the line, half dragged, half carried by a gaunt corporal whose name I never learned, was a woman. Not a soldier. Not in the way we understood it. She wore a tattered wool coat too large for her frame, the collar turned up against the cold, her hair blonde, matted with grimpled back in a fraying braid, and in her arms, wrapped in what looked like a soldier's greatcoat, was a child. Not an adolescent, not a boy pressed into Hitler Youth Service. A child no older than 2, maybe less. His face buried in her shoulder, one tiny hand clutching the fabric of her sleeve as if he knew. Even at that age, that letting go meant vanishing into the snow forever. A murmur passed through our ranks, not of pity, was a luxury we buried with our brothers, but of disbelief. A woman? A baby? In a Wehrmacht prisoner column. It made no sense. Women weren't conscripted. Babies weren't issued field rations. Someone muttered SS experiment, a cruel joke about breeding camps or racial purity nonsense. Another spat into the snow and said, "Shoot 'em both! Faster that way." I said nothing. I was just a lieutenant then, junior enough to follow orders, senior enough to know when they were about to crack like thin ice. Captain Yevgeny Markov stood a few paces ahead, his back to his hands clasped behind him in that rigid posture he always adopted when weighing death. He wasn't a soft man. He'd ordered executions without blinking deserters, collaborators, even wounded Germans who slowed our advance. He carried a Tokarev pistol with a grip worn smooth from use, and a photograph of his sister in his breast pocket, the only thing he'd salvaged from Minsk before the Germans burned it to the ground. His sister hadn't been a soldier either. She'd been a schoolteacher. They shot her for hiding a Jewish student. Now, as the prisoners halted before him, their breath rising in ragged plumes, Markov turned slowly. His eyes gray, like the sky before a blizzard swept the line, lingered on the woman. She didn't look up. She just held the child tighter, rocking slightly, humming something under her breath. A lullaby. German, yes, but the tune was universal, the kind mothers sing when the world is ending and all they have left is a voice. One of our sergeants, Borodin, stepped forward. "Captain," he said, voice low but edged with urgency. "Orders are clear. All prisoners go to processing. No exceptions, especially not." He gestured vaguely at the woman and child. ... Markov didn't answer immediately. He walked toward them, boots crunching in the packed snow, until he stood just an arm, issei length, high. The woman flinched, but didn't retreat. She raised her eyes blue, startlingly clear against the grime, and met his gaze. No plea, no defiance. Just a quiet, unbearable exhaustion. He looked at the child. The boy stirred, blinked, then reached out a mittened hand toward Markov's coat button, as if mistaking it for a toy. And then, without warning, without consultation, without even glancing at the men behind him, Markov unclipped his sidearm and handed it to Bort. "Take them to the medical tent," he said, voice flat, final. Give them dry clothes. Hot broth. Keep them there until further notice. Borodin stared, as if the Ben's true. Sir, that's an order, Markov cut in, his tone leaving no room for debate. The rest of the prisoners. Process as usual, but these two stay. A silence fell that was deeper than winter itself. Not just quiet, but the stunned, suffocating hush of men realizing the ground beneath their feet has just tilted into unknown territory. In the Red Army, compassion wasn't weakness, it was treason. And a German woman with a child, that wasn't a prisoner. That was a symbol of everything we've been taught to hate. The mothers who raised the soldiers, who burned our villages. The wives who cheered as panzers rolled over orphanages. The civilians who turned away as our people were shot in ditches. Yet here stood our captain battle-hardened, grieving, decorated twice for bravery offering broth to the enemy. I watched as two medics approached, hesitant, and gently guided the woman away. She didn't resist. She just kept humming, her voice barely audible over the wind, as if lulling not only her son, but herself, into believing this moment of grace was real. Behind me, I heard Borodin mutter, "He's lost his mind." Another soldier crossed himself, a habit we'd all been taught to abandon, but which returned in moments of true fear. Not fear of death, fear of moral chaos. Markov stood alone in the snow for a long time after they'd gone, staring at the horizon where the front lines pulsed like a raw nerve. I wanted to ask him why, not out of curiosity, but because in that instant, something fundamental had shifted, not just in command, but in the fragile contract that held our unit together. We followed orders because they kept us alive. But this felt like something else, like a crack in the ice over a river we all knew was frozen with corpses. No one spoke as we marched the remaining prisoners away, but I could feel it to the first tremor of dissent, coiled tight in the silence, waiting for the right moment to break. The medical tent stood at the edge of the encampment, half buried in snowdrifts, its canvas walls flapping like the wings of a dying bird. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of carbolic acid, boiled linen, and the sour temps of unwashed bodies slowly thawing. The woman, her name was Elk, we learned later, though no one asked it aloud, sat on a cot near the stove, the child asleep in her lap, his breathing shallow but steady. A medic had given her a bowl of weak barley broth and a pair of dry socks. She ate, slowly, methodically, as though each spoonful were a vow she was keeping. No guard stood outside, not jit, but eyes watched from every direction through the slats of supply wagons, from behind ration crates, from the shadowed corners of the command bunker. Word spread faster than frostbite in that cold. The captain spared a German woman and her boy, fed them, sheltered them, and with the word came something darker. Tao. Not in Markov's courage he led charges through minefields, with nothing but a pistol and a curse, but in his loyalty. In the war we were fighting, loyalty wasn't abstract. It was measured in how many enemies you left in the snow. That evening, during the change of watch, Borodin approached me near the ammunition pit. His face was tight, his breath curling in sharp bursts. "You were there," he said, not as a question, but as an accusation. Tell me. I heard wrong. Tell me he didn't. He did, I cut in. He ordered her kept alive, separated from the others. Borodin stared at the ground, then kicked a frozen clump of earth. "My wife," he said quietly, "was in Smolensk when the Sandar Commando came through. They didn't spare her. They didn't spare our daughter. They lined them up in the schoolyard and shot them for hiding a priest." He looked up, eyes burning. "And now our captain gives hot broth to a German mother." I had no answer. What could I say? That war wasn't arithmetic. That grief didn't justify more grief. In the East, those words were as useless as a rusted bayonet. Inside the command tent, Markov sat at his field desk, map pins scattered like fallen stars across a topographic chart of Belarus. He didn't look up as I entered. "They're talking," I said. "Let 'em talk," he replied, voice low. You know what this looks like." "I know what it is," he snapped, finally meeting my eyes. "That child didn't burn villages. He didn't shoot civilians. He didn't invade anyone's home. He's 2 years old, Lieutenant. 2, and his father." I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Dead. Buried somewhere near Rocher," she told the medic. "Ah? Grenadier. Drafted in 42. Never came home." Markov stood and walked to the tent flap, peering out into the twilight. "You think I don't remember, Minsk? You think I don't wake up hearing my sister scream? But if we become the thing we refight, and if we kill children because their blood is the wrong color, then what was the point of surviving?" His voice cracked on the last word, just slightly. "Enough." I didn't argue, not because I agreed, but because I understood. This wasn't strategy. This wasn't politics. This was the last flicker of something human in a war that had spent 5 years grinding humanity into ash. But understanding didn't stop what came next. 2 nights later, during the midnight watch, 3 soldiers Borodin, among them, entered the medical tent without orders. They didn't carry rifles, just knives, standard issue, but drawn. The medic on duty, Private Kobalinko, barely 20, tried to block the entrance. "You can't," he whispered fiercely. "Captain's direct order." Borodin shoved him aside. "Captain's lost his mind. We're saving his soul." They found Elk awake, the child curled against her chest. She didn't scream. She just stood, placing herself between them and the cot, arms outstretched like a shield made of bone and threadbare wool. One of the soldiers, Petrenko, from Odessa. "Every German is a weapon," Borodin growled, "even the quiet ones." But before he could move, boots crunched in the snow outside. Markov stood in the entrance, coat unbuttoned, Tokarev in hand, not aimed, but present. "Put your knives away," he said, voice colder than the wind. Borodin turned slowly. "You'd shoot your own men for this." "I'd shoot anyone who disobeys a direct order in a combat zone," Markov replied. "Even you." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The tent seemed to hold its breath. Then Petrenko lowered his blade. The third man followed, but Borodin just stared at Markov, his face a mask of betrayal so raw it looked like pain. "You think you're being merciful," Borodin said quietly, "but you're making us weak, and weakness gets us killed." He walked out without another word. The others followed. Markov didn't holster his pistol until they were gone. Then he turned to Elk, who still stood rigid, eyes wide, one hand pressed over her son's mouth, as if to muffle even his breathing. "It's over," he said in broken German. "You're safe." But as he left the tent, shoulders hunched against the cold, I knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. What had happened in that tent wasn't just disobedience. It was the first fracture in the Unit S spine, and fractures in the East rarely healed. They spread. By dawn, the rumor had twisted. The captain is protecting a Nazi spy. He's been bribed. He's gone soft. Men who had followed him through the hell of Stalingrad now avoided his gaze during roll call. Rations arrived late to his tent. Orders were misplaced. And in the mess line, someone began leaving a single blackened potato on the ground where he usually sat, a silent, bitter offering to a man they no longer recognized as one of their own. Still, Markov held firm. He posted a guard at the medical tent, not because he didn't trust the others, but because he knew exactly how much he couldn't. And so I stood watch, rifle slung, eyes scanning the dark, listening to the wind carry whispers that sounded less like loyalty and more like rebellion. Behind me, through the thin canvas, I could hear El coming again. The same lullaby, faint, fragile, relentless. Each note felt like a countdown. The thaw came not with warmth, but with mud-thick, sucking, the color of dried blood. It slowed everything. Supply convoys, patrols, even the rhythm of executions in the ravine to the east. but it did nothing to slow the rot spreading through our unit. By mid-February, the silence around Markov had hardened into something tactical. Men no longer argued in his presence. They simply stopped speaking when he entered a room. Orders were obeyed, but without the sharp precision that once marked our battalion, more like a grim pantomime than disciplined action. Even the cook stopped salting his stew on Markov's watch. A petty cruelty disguised as oversight. I stood guard outside the medical tent every night, rotating shifts with 2 others Markov had personally selected not for loyalty, but for quietness. For the kind of steadiness that didn't need slogans to hold its ground. Elkin, the boy's name was Lucas, though I only learned it weeks later when the medic overheard her whispering it during a fever dream. Remained inside, kept separate from the wounded, fed from the officers' rations. No one spoke to them. No one harmed them. But the air around them grew heavier, charged with the unspoken belief that their mere presence was an insult to every grave we'd dug since 41. On a gray afternoon when the clouds hung so low, they seemed to scrape the treat. A courier arrived from Division HQ. Not in a staff car, but on horseback. The animal lathered and trembling. He carried sealed orders stamped with a red star and a secondary insignia. I had seen since the purges of 37 NKVD liaison. Markov read the dispatch alone in his tent. When he emerged, his face was the color of wet stone. Assembly in 10 minutes, he announced, voice stripped of inflection. Full company, weapons grounded. We gathered in the central yard, the mud pulling at our boots like hands, trying to drag us under. The courier stood beside Markov, arms crossed, eyes scanning us with the detached curiosity of a man who knew he'd never have to bleed with us. Markov unrolled the order. Effective immediately, he began, all non-essential personnel are to be prisoners of war under medical observation. He paused, just long enough for the implication to settle, are to be transferred to Field Processing Unit 14, located near Mogilev. A cold ripple moved through the ranks. Field Processing Unit 14 wasn't a camp. It was a euphemism. Everyone knew what happened there. Borodin, standing near the front, didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened, and his fingers twitched toward his belt, where his knife usually hung, though today all weapons were grounded. Markov continued, reading the rest of the order with mechanical precision. Troop movements, supply quotes, new patrol rotations, but no one heard it. All anyone heard was the sentence passed on Elkin Lucas. After the assembly disbanded, I found Markov in the supply barn, breaking down crates for firewood. His hands were raw, knuckles split from the cold. They're using us, I said quietly. He didn't stop swinging the axe. They always have. They know what'll happen in Mogilev. They know, he said, driving the blade into a pine slab with more force than necessary. And they don't care. Or worse, they care enough to make sure it happens. I hesitated. You could refuse. He laughed, a short, dry sound, like ice cracking. Refusan NKV diendost order, they'd shoot me before sunrise, and 10 TD, shoot her anyway, with my name on the report. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his glove, but I won't deliver her myself. That night, under a moonless sky, Markov called for volunteers. Not officially. Not in writing. Just a whisper passed between cots. If you still believe in something beyond vengeance, meet at the North Gate at 0200. Only 4 came. Kovalenko, the young medic, a sapper named Rizov, who'd lost both brothers in the siege of Lenin, a radio operator, Zedzov, who still wore his dead wife's locket under his tunic, and me. We didn't speak as we approached the medical tent. The sentry loyal to Markov, not the orderer, stepped aside without a word. Inside, Elk was awake, bundled in a wool blanket, Luca's asleep against her chest. She looked up as we entered, eyes wide but not afraid, as if she'd been waiting. Markov knelt before her. We're getting you out, he said in halting German. Tonight, west, toward the American lines. She shook her head. They'll kill you. Maybe, he said, "but not tonight." He handed her a map drawn on the back of a ration wrapper, marked with trails only partisans knew, a compass, a Kent, and his own officers, pistol loaded, safety off. "Follow the river until you reach the bend near Shklo. There's a fishing hut. A man there, his name is Ilya, will help you cross. Tell him Markov sent you, Hilna." She took the items slowly, fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. Not gratitude, recognition. As if she understood, finally, that this wasn't about her. It was about what he refused to let the war take from him. We moved quickly. No lanterns, no voices. Through the mud, past the latrine trench. Along the tree line where the snow still clung in patches like old scars. At the perimeter of Fencemoor, symbolic than functionally, cut a gap just wide enough for one person to slip through. Elk hesitated at the edge, looking back at the camp, at the dim glow of the command tent, at the men who had spared her not out of kindness, but out of defiance. "Go!" Markov whispered. She turned, pulled Lukas tighter, and vanished into the dark. We returned before dawn, boots caked, hands shaking not from cold, but from the weight of what we'd done. Back in our cots, we didn't sleep. We listened. 4 alarms. Four shouts for the sound of boots coming to take us away. But morning came quietly. Too quietly. At roll call, Borodin stood at the front, expression unreadable. The courier from HQ was gone, and when the medic reported for duty, he was told the medical tent was being reorganized. No one asked about Elk. No one mentioned Lucas. But as the day wore on, I noticed the glances longer, sharper, aimed not at Markov, but at us. The 4 who'd been missing from our cots, the 4 who now carried a secret like a live grenade in our chests. That afternoon, during a routine equipment inspection, Borodin discovered a missing field knife, his own, and accused Rizov of stealing it. It was absurd. Transparent. But the charge stuck. Rizov was confined to the stockade, pending inquiry. It wasn't about a knife. It was a message. And that night, as I stood watch again, this time outside the empty medical tent, I heard voices near the command. "Bunker, low, urgent." Planning. Markov's act of mercy hadn't ended with Elk's escape. It had just lit the fuse. The mutiny didn't begin with gunfire. It began with silence, the kind that gathers before a storm, thick and humming with unspoken intent. 3 nights after Elk vanished into the dark, the entire company skipped evening rations. Not as protest, not openly, but as a quiet refusal. We sat on our bunks, backs turned to the mess line, boots unlaced, as if exhaustion had finally claimed us all at once. But I saw the glances exchanged in the firelight, the flicker of resolve, in eyes that had long ago learned not to hope. Borodin moved among them, like a shadow given purpose, whispering not in corners, but in the open, his voice low but steady, as though he no longer cared who heard. "They'll send us to Mogilev next," he said once, loud enough for half the barracks to catch it. "Not as guards, as prisoners, because we followed a man who put a German child above his own soldiers. No one denied it, because no one could. Markov knew. Of course he knew. He'd been a soldier too long to mistake the shift in air pressure that precedes betrayal, yet he did nothing. No arrests, no speeches. He simply continued his duties with the same rigid precision, as if by acting normally he could will normalcy back into existence. But the men no longer saluted when he passed. They didn't look away. Met his gaze, not with disrespect, but with a terrible, hollow clarity, as if they'd already mourned him. Then, on the morning of February 18th, orders came down. Our battalion was to advance 10 kilometers east to reinforce a position near Orsha. Standard rotation, except the route would take us directly past Field Processing Unit 14. Coincidence? No one believed in coincidences anymore. That night, I found Markov alone in the command tent, packing maps into a satchel. His pistol lay on the desk, unloaded. "They're going to do it during the march," I said without preamble. He didn't look up. I know. You could request detachment. Say you're ill. And leave them to face it alone? He finally met my eyes. This isn't about me anymore, Lieutenant. It's about what we become when we decide some lives are worth less than others. Outside, boots crunched in the mud, not patrol rhythm. Too deliberate? Too many. They're coming now, I said. Markov nodded slowly, then picked up his pistol and tucked it into his belt still. Unloaded, then let them come. The tent flap parted. Borodin entered first, followed by 6 others, all armed, all with their collars, unbuttoned the old signal of dissent, dating back to the Civil War. Behind them stood Rizov, released from the stockade, his face bruised but his stance firm. Even he had chosen a side. Borodin stopped 2 paces from the desk. We're not going to Orsha, he said. We're turning west, toward the American lines. A beat of silence. Then Markov spoke, voice calm. Desertion is punishable by firing squad. You know that? We're not deserting, Borodin countered. We're refusing an order that violates the spirit of the Red Army. You taught us that, remember? A soldier follows orders, but never his conscience. You said that in Stalingrad. Markov almost smiled. I also said a good officer dies before he lets his men become monsters. And yet, Borodin said, stepping closer, you spared the very people who made monsters of us. The tension in the tent was a live wire. I could feel it in my teeth, in the pulse behind my eyes. This wasn't just a mutiny, it was a reckoning. Long delayed, now erupting in the only language the Eastern Front understood. Ultimatums and barrels. Markov sighed, a sound like wind through ruins. If you go west, they'll hunt you. Not just us. The Americans too. They'll hand you back. And then, well, you know what happens to mutineers? We'd rather face a firing squad as men, Rizov said quietly, than live as ghosts who traded their souls for rations. Another silence. Then Markov reached into his tunic and pulled out a small envelope. He tossed it onto the desk. Take it, he said. Inside are false papers, names, birthplaces, unit numbers all forged. Good enough to pass a cursory check. There's also a map. Safer routes, partisan contacts. Borodin stared at it as if it were a snake. Why? Because I won't stop you, Markov said. And I won't join you. But I won't watch you walk into a trap without warning. For the first time, Borodin's resolve wavered. You'd let us go. I'd rather lose soldiers to desertion than to hatred, Markov replied. At least deserters can come back. Hatred. That stays. One by one, the men looked at each other. No grand speeches. No oaths. Just this ludorning understanding that the line had been redrawn not on a map, but in the marrow of their bones. They took the envelope, without thanks, without shame, just necessity. By dawn, 17 men were gone, not in a rush, not in chaos, but with the quiet efficiency of professionals slipping through a gap in the world. The rest remained, some out of loyalty, some out of fear, some because they simply didn't know how to be anything but soldiers. Markov reported the desertions himself, falsified the logs, said they'd been ambushed by partisans. No one questioned it. Not 10 weeks later, as the front shifted and our unit was folded into another regiment, I heard whispers. 2 deserters had made it to the American zone. 3 were shot crossing the Dnieper. Borodin's fate was unknown, but one rumor stuck, unprovable, yet stubborn as frost, that a woman and a small boy were seen near Bremen in the spring of 45, walking with a group of displaced persons, the woman humming a lullaby as she held the child's hand. Markov was court-martialed that summer. Not for the desertions, those were buried, but for command negligence and failure to maintain discipline. He was demoted, reassigned to a supply depot in Siberia. He never spoke of it again. I saw him once, years later, in a train station in Novosibirsk, older, thinner, but still carrying himself like a man who'd once held the line between mercy and massacre and chosen the harder path. He didn't recognize me, or maybe he did. and chose not to say. As the train pulled away, I thought of Elk, of Lucas, of the 17 men who walked into the dark because their captain dared to see a child where others saw only the enemy. In the East, they say war has no memory, but sometimes, in the silence between heartbeats, it remembers everything.